For 6 months, I worked tirelessly on a forecast report that could have saved the company millions. I flagged risky investments, detailed revenue leaks, and warned about financial blind spots. I sent the report straight to the CEO. He didn't just ignore it, he buried it. I was brushed off, sidelined, and quietly excluded from meetings. Let leadership handle the big picture stuff, he told me smugly. But when the board launched an emergency audit and discovered a $3.2 million shortfall, suddenly everyone wanted to know, who saw this coming? And all eyes turned back to me, the analyst they'd tried to silence. For the better part of a decade, I'd worked in the financial planning and analysis division at Renshaw Dynamics, a once quiet logistics firm that had become a rising star in the supply chain software world. When I first joined, we were barely scraping mid-seven figures in annual revenue. By year 6, we had crossed the $100 million mark, and by year 8, we were negotiating with international investors. I wasn't the flashiest person in the building. I didn't chase accolades or corporate politics. But I knew numbers. I knew trends. And more importantly, I knew what was coming before it hit the balance sheet. That's why when I compiled the Q2 forecast for the fiscal year, meticulously cross-checking vendor inconsistencies, fluctuating client renewals, and inventory gaps, I flagged a major red alert. We were off. Not just slightly. We were missing at least $3.2 million in projected net revenue that couldn't be accounted for. I went over the numbers again and again. It wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't a spreadsheet error. This was real. And based on timing, I suspected it had something to do with a set of large bulk contracts from a logistics client in Brazil that had been marked as closed but hadn't been paid, or even properly invoiced. I drafted a 22-page report. Not just highlighting the shortfall but breaking down, line by line, exactly where the discrepancies occurred. I included comparisons against prior years, historical norms, contract expectations, and even internal approval timestamps. It was airtight. I called it Forecast Alert, Unresolved $3.2 million variance, and sent it directly to the CFO and the CO, with a courtesy copy to the VP of Finance. No response for 2 days. Then, a curt reply from the CEO, Alan Price. Thanks. Looks like standard variance, Q3 should balance it out. No action required. I blinked at the screen, stunned. No action required? Did he even read the report? Q3 couldn't balance it out because Q3 was already soft from a client divestiture we all knew about. And besides, this wasn't a forecasting miss, it was a data hole. This money wasn't mispredicted. It was gone. I tried again. This time, I requested a meeting directly. I walked down to the executive suite and left a printed copy of the report on Alan's assistant's desk. The next morning, I got a calendar decline and a message. Appreciate your diligence. Trust the finance team to monitor quarterly adjustments. Focus on Q4 prep. I was being dismissed. Politely, but firmly. Alan didn't want eyes on the shortfall. That was the moment the red flag turned into something else entirely. Because if he wasn't just ignoring the data, but burying it, then someone was hiding something far worse than a few missing transactions. So I kept digging. Quietly. I pulled internal contract logs, invoice dispatch records, and vendor payouts from our NetSuite instance. What I found made me stop cold. 2 vendor accounts, both linked to the Brazilian client project, had the same routing information but different company names. Both had received partial payments, signed off by procurement, but not one of those payments had been linked to an actual deliverable. The amounts matched the missing $3.2 million. I looped in our internal audit liaison, Olivia, under the guise of cross-referencing payment reconciliation for my next forecast. She trusted me, we'd worked together for years. When I showed her the mismatched vendor IDs and duplicate banking information, her jaw clenched. "This should have triggered a compliance flag," she whispered. "These payments were approved manually. Bypass the automated check." I nodded. "Alan's signature is on 2 of them." She didn't respond. But I could see it in her eyes. She knew what this meant. I decided not to go to HR. I went to legal. I requested a confidential meeting with our general counsel, Anika. I didn't accuse anyone of fraud, not yet. But I presented my findings and emphasized the risk. She took it seriously. I saw her expression harden as she scrolled through the data trail. "I'll look into this immediately," she promised. 2 days later, I was pulled into a surprise meeting with Alan and the head of HR. Alan was all smiles. "We wanted to talk about your work ethic," he said. "You've been operating outside your role's scope. It's been noticed." I stayed quiet. "The team's been under pressure," he continued, "and instead of focusing on your deliverables, you've spent too much time chasing side investigations." That's what he called it. Side investigations. Then came the kicker. HR handed me a formal performance warning. Something about collaborative friction and unsanctioned audits. I was speechless. They were trying to silence me. But I wasn't backing down. Not with $3.2 million unaccounted for, and now, active cover-up attempts on top of it. The warning sat on my desk like a threat wrapped in corporate language. I'd seen enough in my years to know what this meant. If I didn't fall in line, I'd be next on the chopping block. But I also knew something far bigger was going on. This wasn't just about a missed forecast or a sloppy transaction. Someone had orchestrated a financial deception, and the CEO was now actively suppressing efforts to expose it. What I had discovered wasn't just an error. It was fraud. And it wasn't just a cover-up. It was coordinated. After the so-called performance conversation, I knew I had to be more careful. But I wasn't going to let this go. My gut, and the numbers, were screaming at me to keep going. That night, I remotely accessed our archival system and ran a differential query, one that compared procurement records over the last 5 quarters for discrepancies between approval timing and contract delivery. It took hours, but what came back made my skin crawl. At least 3 more vendor accounts, on projects that were supposedly closed and successful, had signatures from Alan or his close friend and procurement VP, Rick Devlin. All had been marked paid, yet there were no receipts of goods delivered or services rendered. They were shell accounts. Ghost vendors. The total across those accounts? $1.9 million. Which meant the actual whole wasn't $3.2 million anymore, it was over $5 million. And yet, every one of those transactions had been buried inside quarterly adjustments or blamed on client-side changes. The paper trail was getting dangerous, and I knew I couldn't do this alone anymore. I reached back out to Anika in legal and asked for a private follow-up. When we met in her office, door closed, blinds down, she leaned in and whispered, "You were right. I found irregularities. But someone is blocking the compliance team from escalating it. I can't say who yet. But you need to be careful." I sat back. "I think it's time the board saw the report." She looked at me, silent. Not surprised. Then gave the smallest nod I'd ever seen. That weekend, I spent nearly 18 hours assembling a new version of the report. This one wasn't just financial anomalies and forecasting flags. This was a full breakdown of the evidence trail. A comparison of vendor payouts, signed approvals, project documentation inconsistencies, and system logs showing backdated entries. I even attached the metadata from the approval system showing changes made at odd hours, always under Alan or Rick's credentials. I didn't send it to the board directly, not yet. That would trigger too many alarms. So I reached out to someone I trusted more than anyone else at the company, James Morgan, one of the board's most respected audit committee members. He had been with Renshaw since its early startup days and was known for his integrity. I emailed him from my personal address with a one-line message. Sir, I have evidence of significant financial misconduct at the executive level. Please advise how to proceed. He replied in less than 2 hours. I'll be in the city Tuesday. Meet me at the old Starbucks near 4th and Main. Bring everything. I didn't sleep that night. When I met James, he listened without interrupting. I showed him the full report on a password-locked tablet. When he finished, he just looked at me for a long time. Do you have backups? I nodded. 3. Encrypted. Good. I'll handle it from here. But be prepared for pushback. They won't go quietly. And they didn't. The next morning, I was summoned by HR again. This time, the tone was different, sharper. They accused me of breaching data security protocols. They claimed I had accessed restricted files. They hinted at termination if behavior continues. I knew this was Alan's doing. He realized someone knew. He was trying to contain the damage. But the board had already been tipped off. James had done what he promised. He'd forwarded my findings, along with his own notes, to the full audit committee. An emergency session was scheduled. Alan didn't show up to work the next day. Then, the email came. Subject line. Urgent, immediate freeze on financial authorizations. The CFO, legal, compliance, and audit heads were all on the chain. Alan was not. The hammer was coming down. A day later, we were summoned to an all-staff meeting where the chairman of the board, someone none of us had seen in person for over 2 years, stepped into the building and addressed the company. We have uncovered significant concerns regarding financial integrity and internal controls. Effective immediately, our CEO Alan Price is on leave, pending a formal investigation. There it was. Truth starting to pierce the surface. But even as the room murmured in shock, I felt no joy. No vindication. Just relief. And fear. Because I knew, despite what they were saying publicly, this wasn't over. The next day, a private investigator retained by the board asked to interview me. I agreed. I showed them the original forecast report. The emails. The vendor inconsistencies. The digital logs. Everything. I didn't hold back. And at the end of it all, the investigator looked at me and said, "You just saved this company from a disaster." I didn't say anything back. I was too exhausted. Too drained. But inside, I felt something shift. The silence was over. The air was heavy the morning after the emergency board meeting. Everyone walked through the halls as if stepping on eggshells, heads down, whispers trading places like currency. Alan's office door, usually slightly ajar, was shut tight. Word had spread quickly, he was on leave, but no one believed that meant a vacation. I showed up that morning determined to keep my head down, but the spotlight had already found me. I wasn't just the guy who wrote the report anymore. I was the one who'd made the board move. People either avoided me entirely or gave subtle nods of acknowledgement, some respectful, some resentful. It was clear I had changed the internal landscape, and not everyone liked it. But I wasn't thinking about office politics. I was thinking about how the rest of the truth would finally come to light. The investigation team had started working full-time, and the first thing they asked for was direct access to my laptop, source files, internal communications, and any backups I had stored off-site. I complied completely. I had nothing to hide, and everything to gain from transparency. They were impressed by how meticulously I documented my steps. Every transaction, every anomaly, every conversation with legal or compliance. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about being precise. Truth doesn't require decoration. It only needs proof. While the investigators dug deeper, an interim CEO was appointed, Monica Feldman, a veteran operations strategist from the board's executive bench. She had a reputation for crisis management and zero tolerance for internal corruption. Her first move was brutal and brilliant. She froze all discretionary accounts, vendor contracts, and high-level expense authorizations. No money moved unless her office approved it. Her second move? She called me in. "I read your report," she said, her tone clipped but curious. "It's thorough. Painfully thorough." I figured it needed to be. She looked at me carefully. "How deep do you think this goes?" "At least 5 million. Maybe more if we track older fiscal years. But it's not just about the money. It's about the culture that allowed it." She nodded slowly. "That's what I needed to hear. You'll be working directly with me and the board's audit subcommittee from here forward." The room went quiet as she signed a temporary reassignment letter, giving me direct access to every financial system in the company. I wasn't just an analyst anymore. I was now the board's point person inside the war room. The following weeks were a whirlwind. I cross-referenced fiscal records dating back 3 years. I tracked a pattern of inflated vendor contracts, prepayment clauses with no delivery schedules, and consultant fees paid to firms with vague service descriptions and no physical offices. I compiled it all, row by row, line by line, until I had a conclusive timeline showing exactly how the CEO and his inner circle manipulated the accounting systems to siphon millions into external accounts and friendly shells. Meanwhile, Monica was reshuffling leadership quietly. Several senior directors who had benefited from Alan's favoritism were restructured out or moved to special projects. Everyone knew what that meant. But not everyone was going quietly. I received an anonymous tip from an internal source who said someone from Alan's old circle had tried to delete archived invoices from the procurement server. I rushed to the IT team, who, thankfully, had implemented a full read-only mirror after Monica took over. The deletion attempt failed, but the system flagged the login credentials used. It was Rick Devlin. He'd been trying to wipe out the evidence trail. I handed the findings to Monica and the investigation team immediately. That same day, Rick's badge was deactivated. He was escorted from the building, and a forensics team was called in to preserve every byte of his digital activity. The web of corruption was unraveling quickly. The biggest revelation came in the form of a hidden clause inside an obscure contract related to an offshore strategic partner. Buried in legalese was a clause that diverted a portion of each quarter's marketing budget, nearly $300,000 each cycle, into an entity linked to a Cayman Islands account. That account, investigators found, had ties to a private firm co-owned by Alan's college roommate. It wasn't just corporate fraud. It was a deliberate, well-hidden scheme of embezzlement and misappropriation that had been running undetected for years. By the end of month 1, the total amount traced back to Alan and his ring exceeded $7.4 million. The board convened another emergency meeting, this one even more confidential than the last. Only 4 people were invited to brief them: Monica, the lead investigator, James Morgan, and me. As we stood before the board, I laid it all out, step by step. There was no emotion in my delivery. Only facts, charts, and time-stamped evidence. It wasn't my job to punish, it was my job to illuminate. When I finished, the chairman of the board, a usually stoic man named Franklin Hayes, looked directly at me. "Why didn't you walk away when this first got buried?" "Because I couldn't unsee it," I said quietly. "And because silence would have made me complicit." He nodded once. Then turned to Monica. "Clean it up." "All of it." Alan Price was officially terminated 2 days later. So was Rick. Legal charges were filed against both men, including conspiracy to commit fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and obstruction of internal investigations. Civil suits followed. But the biggest surprise? The board didn't just thank me. They promoted me. Effective immediately, I was named Executive Director of Corporate Compliance and Financial Strategy, a new role built to ensure something like this never happened again. My name, once lost in ignored emails and buried reports, now sat in the executive directory. I never sought power. But I had found purpose. And the company had found its conscience. The days that followed my promotion were a strange mixture of quiet triumph and unrelenting pressure. I was no longer the analyst quietly crunching numbers in a corner. Now, every major decision involving money, ethics, or compliance crossed my desk. My new office was 2 doors down from the interim CEO. It had glass walls, which meant transparency, literally and figuratively, was expected from here on out. But my job wasn't just symbolic. Monica had made it clear, this company either rebuilds its spine with you, or it folds from within. I had no illusions about what came next. Alan and Rick may have been removed, but the systems they'd twisted were still in place. Procurement, finance, legal, vendor relations, each of those departments had at least one person still quietly loyal to the old regime. Some were complicit. Some were scared. And some simply didn't want the status quo to change. That's why I didn't just start with audits, I started with people. One of my first moves was assembling a cross-departmental task force. But I didn't pick the usual suspects. I chose overlooked employees, the ones who weren't flashy but always got things done right. The quiet procurement officer who flagged inconsistencies and got ignored. The mid-level legal analyst who asked questions during policy reviews. The accounts payable clerk who knew every vendor ID by memory. I brought them into a room and said, "You've seen the cracks. Now help me seal them." We created a plan. Every high-risk vendor was put on a probationary contract. All internal expense reports above $5,000 required secondary verification. An ethics hotline was relaunched with full anonymity. And perhaps most importantly, we installed an AI-driven anomaly detection system to flag suspicious invoice patterns in real time. As those systems rolled out, people noticed. There were a few resignations, quiet exits from employees who suddenly decided to pursue other opportunities. That was fine. We didn't chase them. Their absence spoke volumes. Then came the retaliation attempt. It started small. I began getting anonymous emails implying that I had my own conflicts of interest. Then, rumors started circulating, claims that I had only exposed the fraud to fast-track my own promotion. Finally, someone leaked an old internal chat where I had vented frustrations about the executive team. It was nothing damning, just raw emotion from a late night 2 years ago, but it was clearly meant to discredit me. I brought it all to Monica. She wasn't surprised. "It means they're worried. It means you're working." Then she paused. "But we're not playing defense. Let's take this head on." Together, we launched an internal transparency campaign. I published an open memo explaining every change we were implementing, why they were necessary, and how we would measure success. Monica signed it with me. Then we hosted a live Q&A for the entire company, no pre-screened questions, no PR script. Just truth. I won't lie, some of the questions were brutal. How did leadership allow this to happen? What if you're just another version of the same problem? Why should we trust anything anymore? I answered them all, carefully, honestly, and with evidence. I showed them charts, process maps, and the documented gaps we were closing. But I also said the words no one else had dared to say. We failed. We failed you. And failure isn't fixed by silence, it's fixed by action. The tide began to turn after that. One day, I received an envelope in my internal mailbox. No name. Just a single USB stick and a printed message, "You'll want to see this. Vendor 4318. I ran the ID. It was one of Alan's recurring consulting vendors, a small marketing firm supposedly delivering quarterly strategy sessions. But with that came responsibility. The next few weeks were brutal. I worked longer hours than I ever had, poring over every market trend, competitive analysis, cost optimization lever, and innovation forecast. I consulted engineers, marketers, supply chain managers, and even legal to model risk scenarios. And when I presented that 5-year roadmap to the board, it didn't just outline revenue growth. It mapped integrity into every milestone. Brian smiled. You just gave us a vision we can believe in. Later, as I walked back to my office, I passed a janitor I'd seen a dozen times before. He paused, looked at me, and said quietly, "You turned this place around, didn't you?" I smiled. Not alone. But I helped. And that meant everything. The aftermath of exposing a financial scandal isn't always clean. Alan and Rick may have been removed, but what they left behind wasn't just a paper trail, it was a leadership vacuum. And leadership voids can be dangerous if left unchecked. Even though I had stepped up as interim CFO and gained the board's trust, I wasn't naive. Corporate memory is short. Turnarounds are only celebrated if they translate into numbers. Goodwill fades if the company doesn't perform. And I had no intention of letting this organization slide back into chaos. That meant transforming the very DNA of how we operated. It started with people. I worked closely with HR to revamp hiring policies. Under Alan's regime, positions had often been filled through favors or nepotism, an unspoken old boys club culture. We tore that down. Transparent hiring panels, score-based evaluations, and a fresh focus on diversity were introduced. For the first time in 5 years, we opened internship opportunities to students from state colleges, not just Ivy League feeders. But personnel was just one side of the coin. The real change had to be cultural. To that end, I introduced what I called the Integrity Index. It was a quarterly pulse survey, anonymous, simple, and brutally honest. Employees rated how transparent, fair, and accountable they felt leadership was being. The results were shared with everyone, including the board. And if any department scored low, it triggered a review, not punitive, but corrective. The first quarter revealed predictable truths. Finance and procurement scored low, residual distrust from the scandal. Engineering and customer support scored highest, departments that had always been on the receiving end of poor decision-making. But something changed after that first report, conversations. People started talking. Leaders began asking their teams, "How can I improve this number?" The metrics weren't just a report, they became a mirror. Within 2 quarters, every department had improved by at least 15%. Still, there was one looming challenge: our reputation in the marketplace. Vendors were cautious. Clients were skeptical. Competitors smelled blood. We couldn't just rely on internal progress, we had to send a message. So, with Monica and the marketing team, we launched a bold transparency campaign. We held an open town hall for major stakeholders, clients, investors, analysts. We didn't sugarcoat anything. We walked them through what went wrong, what we had fixed, and what accountability steps we had taken, including independent external audits, not just once, but biannually. Whistleblower protections, now embedded into contracts. A rotating internal ethics committee with representation from all departments. One investor raised their hand and asked, "Why should we believe you now?" I stepped up to the mic. "You shouldn't," I said plainly. "You should watch what we do over the next year and decide for yourself." That honesty landed harder than any polished PR pitch. In the following months, several major partners who had previously pulled back began to re-engage. One, a Fortune 100 client who'd nearly dropped us, signed a renewed 3-year agreement after an audit confirmed our new reporting structure. And then came the unexpected, a call from the Department of Commerce. They had seen our internal reforms and wanted us to consult on a pilot program encouraging mid-sized tech firms to adopt stronger financial integrity frameworks. We weren't just repairing ourselves, we were becoming a model. But amidst this progress, there was one more thing I had to do. Something personal. I went back to the original email chain where I had sent Alan that $3.2 million forecast, the one he had buried. I scrolled down to the timestamp, the data attachments, the note I had written late that Friday night months ago. "You'll want to look closely at these variances," I had written. I printed it out, framed it, and placed it on the wall of my office. Not out of vanity, but as a reminder that doing the right thing, even when no one's listening, still matters. That sometimes silence is a test. And that persistence has power. Weeks later, during our annual company celebration, Monica took the stage and surprised everyone by announcing a new internal award, the North Star Award, for employees who uphold integrity under pressure. She called my name first. But I knew it wouldn't end with me. That was the point. Because what we had done wasn't just fix broken numbers, we had rebuilt belief. In systems. In accountability. In speaking up. And that belief was now part of our identity. As the celebration ended, I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the junior analysts, engineers, and coordinators laugh and clink glasses. People who had once worked in fear were now free to thrive. Someone tapped my shoulder. It was Emily, the product lead who had once flagged the fake beta project. "You still have that framed email?" she asked, smiling. I nodded. "Yep. Right above my desk." She laughed. "I printed mine too." "The expense report where you caught that shell vendor?" "I keep it in my drawer." We both laughed. Because we knew. Truth leaves a trail. And this time, we were following it forward. The journey from being ignored to becoming the person the board relied on wasn't just a career shift, it was a test of character. I didn't ask to be the whistleblower, the reformer, or the one to clean up after leadership failures. All I wanted was for someone to listen when I saw the red flags. But when no one did, I realized that silence was more dangerous than conflict. What started as a dismissed report turned into a discovery of systematic fraud, negligence, and a toxic leadership culture. But it also became something more, a turning point. Not just for the company, but for everyone who worked there. The fear that had once crept into every department started to fade. People weren't looking over their shoulders anymore. They were speaking up, asking questions, proposing ideas. Transparency stopped being a buzzword and became our baseline. It wasn't easy. Change never is. There were uncomfortable meetings, hard conversations, and long nights where I second-guessed every decision I made. But I kept going. Not out of pride, but out of responsibility. I had the facts. I had the truth. And turning away would have made me just as guilty. In time, even the board began to see that leadership wasn't about dominance or control, it was about trust. And that trust is built in quiet moments, small choices, and consistency. The company didn't just recover. It evolved. Our stock stabilized. Our partners returned. And, most importantly, our people believed again. Looking back, that $3.2 million forecast wasn't just about numbers. It was a mirror, showing us who we really were and who we could become. Ignored at first, but undeniable in the end. And as I finally moved into the permanent CFO role, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because this time, they were listening.